You are standing in a small cabin built of squared spruce logs, chinked with clay and moss, and frozen as hard as stone. It is a Hudson's Bay Company post, though it feels less like a fort and more like a single room set down in the snow at the edge of the known world. The month is January in the year 1825, and outside a cold so deep and so complete has settled over the land that the air itself seems to have stopped moving. The cabin walls are thick and low, and the ceiling beams are dark with the smoke of many winters. A window made of scraped hide, stretched tight and oiled to a dull translucence, lets in a light that has no source, a greyish glow that barely touches the corners of the room. Everything is still. You feel the cold before you understand it. It does not rush in but waits. A patient presence that lives in the cracks between the logs and under the door and in the iron of the stove that sits dark and silent against the far wall. Your breath hangs in front of your face as a pale mist, rising and dissolving, rising again. You are wrapped in wool and a heavy shawl, and your hands are reddened and stiff, but not numb, because you have been awake long enough now to have moved a little, to have set your feet on the cold floorboards and crossed to the work table that stands near the center of the room. The table is made of thick pine planks, its surface worn smooth by years of scraping and stretching and working hide, and it is the quiet heart of this post, the place where the furs are brought and cleaned and made ready for the long journey to the London market. You are the wife of a trapper who was away this morning checking a distant trap line far out in the frozen muskeg, and you are alone with the stillness and the pelts that wait for your hand. On the table your tools are laid out in the same order as yesterday and the day before. A curved iron scraper with a wooden handle that fits the palm like a familiar handshake. A small oblong whetstone, dark with oil. A clay pot of water that has grown a thin skin of ice on its surface. A coil of sinew. A bundle of willow hoops leaning against the table leg, and a stack of beaver pelts brought in last evening from the attached fur store. The pelts are frozen stiff as planks, their fur side matted with frost and their leather side rigid, and they will need to be warmed before you can work them. You do not hurry. There is no need to hurry because the day will be exactly as long as it is, and the cold will hold the world in its grip whether you rush or not. You simply stand for a moment with your hands resting on the edge of the table, listening to the silence that fills the cabin like a held breath. A silence so complete that you can hear the occasional low creak of the logs contracting and the far-off imagined sound of your own heartbeat. The stove is the first thing you attend to because warmth is the currency of this place, the one thing that makes all other things possible. You kneel in front of its cast iron door, which is black and heavy and cold to the touch, and you open it carefully, trying not to make a sound that would disturb the perfect quiet. Inside, the ashes from last night's fire are still banked in a soft grey mound, and in the center, if you look closely, you can see a faint orange eye, where a single coal has survived the long dark hours. You do not blow on it. You simply lean forward and place a handful of dry birch bark curlings on top, the thin papery strips curling and darkening slowly, and then you add a few sticks of split spruce the size of your fingers, arranged like a tiny raft. The heat is so weak at first that it seems almost imaginary, a suggestion of warmth rather than the thing itself. But then the bark catches with a soft whisper, and a thread of pale smoke rises, and a small yellow flame, no bigger than a candle's, begins to lick the understride of the spruce. You watch it without excitement, the way you might watch the slow opening of a winter flower that is not a flower at all, but a return to light. The flame grows, steady and calm, and you add a larger piece of wood, a split log of black spruce that you place carefully so as not to smother the new fire, and then you close the stove door, leaving the air vent open just a crack to let the fire breathe. Now there is a sound in the room, a very low, rhythmic tick and murmur that is not so much a noise as a change in the texture of the silence. The stove begins to radiate a gentle heat that you can feel on your face and hands when you stand close, though the far corners of the cabin will stay cold for hours yet. You rise from your knees and your joints protest in a quiet, familiar way the stiffness of sleeping in a cold loft, and you move back to the table to begin the day's true work. The first beaver pelt waits where you left it, a stiff, frozen oval of reddish-brown fur and pale leather, and you lift it with both hands. It is heavier than it looks, dense with the stored warmth the animal once needed, and it carries a smell that is both clean and wild, the scent of cold water and willow bark, and something deeply animal that no amount of curing can erase. You lay it on a small bench near the stove, not too close, just near enough that the gentle warmth will begin to thaw the frozen tissue without cooking it or making it greasy. You will need to wait for the pelt to become pliable, to bend without cracking, before you can scrape it. In the meantime, there are other small things to do. You take the clay pot and break the film of ice with the back of a spoon, then pour some of the cold water into a smaller wooden bowl. You dip the whetstone in the water and begin to sharpen the scraper, drawing the blade across the stone in long, even strokes that make a sound like rain on a distant roof, a soft shushing that is barely there. The iron brightens under your hand, and you test the edge with your thumb, feeling the fine burr that tells you it is ready. You wipe the blade with a piece of wool cloth and set it down. Then you untangle the willow hoops, which are thin circles of bent willow tied with sinew, each one about the width of a man's shoulders, and you lean them against the wall where they will be within reach later. You check the stack of pelts, counting them without really counting, just letting your fingers move over the stiff fur, noting that there are enough to fill the morning and the afternoon, and perhaps a little of the evening too, if the light holds. And all the while the stove clicks and murmurs and the fire settles into a steady, quiet hum that feels almost like the breathing of the cabin itself. Now you go to the window, drawn by the faint grey light that seems not to increase or decrease, but to hold steady at a point just before dawn, though it is already past the hour of sunrise. You look out through the oiled hide at the world beyond, a world made almost entirely of snow and the dark shapes of spruce trees, their branches bent under the weight of the frozen white. Nothing moves. There is no wind to stir the snow from the boughs, no bird hopping from branch to branch, no animal track marring the smooth surface of the clearing that surrounds the post. The cold has pressed everything into stillness, and even the sky, a uniform blanket of pale cloud, seems frozen in place. The Hudson Bay itself, which you cannot see from here, but which you know is a short walk to the east, lies under a sheet of ice, so thick that the company's ships, now docked in England, are as distant in your mind as the moon. You turn back to the room, and the warmth of the stove wraps around you like a second blanket, and you feel the quiet settle deeper into your bones. The pelt on the bench has begun to soften at the edges, the leather turning from white to a faint, translucent tan. You press it with your thumb and feel the give, the slight springiness that tells you it is ready to be worked. You lift it carefully, draping it over the rounded end of the scraping beam that projects from the work table, a smooth wooden arm that has been polished by countless hides. Then you take up the scraper, settling its curved blade against the flesh side of the beaver skin at the top, just below where the neck would have been, and you push with a gentle, even pressure, drawing the blade down the length of the pelt. The first stroke is always the lightest, a testing stroke that removes nothing but a fine, powdery dust of dried membrane, but it tells you that the angle is right, that the blade is sharp, that the pelt is ready. And so you begin the second stroke, slightly firmer, overlapping the first by a finger's width, and then another and another, until the rhythm of the work settles over you like the rhythm of the fire. The sound the scraper makes is not unpleasant. It is a soft, regular shushing, like the sound of a hand smoothing sand, a noise so constant and so low that it blends with the stove's murmur and the distant tick of the cooling logs. Your mind does not wander to any particular place, but instead rests in the motion itself, the way the blade travels down, the way your wrist adjusts almost imperceptibly to follow the contour of the hide, the way the scrapings curl up in thin, greyish strips and fall onto the apron spread across your lap. The air fills with the clean, quiet smell of worked leather and the faint, metallic tang of the scraper's edge. Outside, the light does not change, and the cold presses against the window like a silent ocean. But inside, in the small circle of warmth cast by the stove, there is only this one steady task, and there is no hurry at all. You work your way across the pelt in sections, from the center outward toward the edges, turning it slightly on the beam as you go. The flesh side is a map of faint veins and tiny imperfections, the record of a life lived in cold water and deep snow, and you scrape it clean until it is smooth and uniform, the color of old parchment. Then you flip the pelt and run your hand over the fur side, which is dense and soft and glossy with its natural oils, checking for any burrs or matted patches, of which there are none. You fold the finished pelt loosely and set it aside on a clean sack, and then you turn back to the bench where the next frozen pelt is already beginning to soften in the gentle heat. The morning will pass in this way, one pelt following another, each one the same as the last, and yet subtly different in size and color and the texture of its fur. You do not count the hours because the hours are not important. What matters is the quiet, repetitive rhythm of the scraper and the growing pile of clean hides and the steady, companionable warmth of the stove. And as the fire settles into a bed of bright coals, and the first thin flame that licked the underside of a split log slowly gives way to a deeper, steadier glow, the cabin remains as it has been since you rose, a small pocket of warmth and stillness and patience in the heart of a winter that has no end. There is no sound but the shush of the scraper and the soft settling of the firewood, and the distant, almost inaudible creak of the frozen world outside. You breathe the cold air and the warm air together, and your hands move in their remembered pattern, and the long, silent morning of January 1825 stretches out before you like a path through deep snow, unhurried and calm. The fire that you lit before the first grey suggestion of dawn has now burned down to a bed of coals, a deep orange glow that breathes softly behind the iron grate of the stove. You do not let it go out, because a fire allowed to die in this cold is a small catastrophe, a loss of warmth that would take hours to recover, and so you tend it with the same quiet patience you bring to every task in this frozen post. You kneel once more on the worn floorboards, feeling the cold through the wool of your skirt, and you open the stove door with a careful hand. The rush of cooler air makes the coals brighten, a sudden flush of color that fades just as quickly, and you reach for the woodpile to your right, where split lengths of black spruce are stacked in a neat, diminishing row. Choosing the right piece of wood is a small act of attention. You select a split log that is not too thick, about the width of your forearm, its bark still clinging in rough, dark scales, and its inner face smooth and pale and faintly sticky with resin. You place it across the coals without hurry, letting it rest at an angle so that the air can move beneath it. And then you add two thinner sticks, one on each side, like quiet companions. The wood hisses slightly where it touches the heat, a brief protest of frozen moisture, and then a small, clear flame appears at the edge of the bark, licking upward in a slow curl. You watch this flame as it grows, not with expectation, but with the same calm acceptance you might bring to watching snow fall, knowing that it will do what it does in its own time, and that your only task is to give it the conditions it needs. As the new wood catches, you adjust the air vent with a gentle nudge of your thumb, opening it just enough to let the fire breathe more deeply without rushing it. The sound inside the stove changes from a soft whispery tick to a steadier, lower hum, a sound that seems to settle into the walls and the floor and the very air of the cabin. You close the stove door, leaving it slightly ajar for a moment to watch the fire establish itself, and you feel the first real wave of warmth push outward against your face, a dry, clean heat that smells of burning spruce and the faint sweetness of the resin. The cold that had been sitting in the corners of the room, the kind of cold that makes the skin on your arms tighten and your knuckles ache, begins its slow retreat, though you know it will never fully leave. Not in January, not here. You rise from the floor, your knees pressing into the wood with a soft sound, and you brush your hands together to knock away the bits of bark and the fine dust of wood ash. The cabin is still dim, the oiled window glowing with that same pale, unchanging light that seems not to come from any particular direction, but simply to exist as a property of the air itself. You move to the table where your tools wait, and you touch them not because you need them yet, but because the act of touching them is part of the rhythm that begins every day, a way of telling your hands that the work will soon come. The scraper lies where you left it, its curved blade showing a faint line of light along the edge, and the whetstone sits beside it, still damp from its morning dip. The willow hoops lean against the table leg, their bent forms casting thin shadows that sway almost imperceptibly as the firelight moves. Everything is as it was, everything is in its place, and the stillness of the room is so complete that you can hear the soft settling of the ash in the stove, a sound like the distant fall of very fine sand. Now comes the first pelt, the one you set aside earlier while you were building up the fire. It lies on a low wooden bench that you have placed not too close to the stove, a bench made of a single thick plank with legs that are slightly uneven, so that it rocks just a little when you touch it. The pelt is still frozen, stiff as a sheet of bark, its fur side covered in a fine white bloom of frost that catches the firelight and sparkles with a cold, mineral brilliance. You lift it with both hands, feeling its weight and its unyielding shape, and you lay it carefully on the bench so that the leather side faces up toward the warm air that is beginning to circulate down from the ceiling. The process of thawing a pelt is a slow, subtle negotiation with the cold, and you know from years of this work that you cannot rush it. Too close to the stove, and the leather will begin to cook, turning brittle and greasy, and losing the supple strength that the London furriers demand. Too far away and it will remain frozen through the whole morning, and your scraper will skip uselessly across its surface, leaving white scratches that will show as flaws in the finished hide. So you position it exactly where the warmth is gentle, a place where if you hold your hand a few inches above the bench, you can feel a mild, even heat, but no sharp edge of hot air, and you leave it there to begin its slow transformation. While the pelt warms, you turn your attention to the kettle. It is a blackened iron vessel, heavy and squat, sitting on the back corner of the stove where the heat is steady but not fierce. You lift its lid, which is also heavy and also blackened, and a puff of steam rises into the cooler air of the room, carrying the faint, resinous scent of the spruce tips that you steeped in it the night before. The water inside is still hot enough for tea, though it will not boil again until you push the kettle directly over the flames, and so you ladle some of the pale, amber-colored liquid into a tin cup that you take from a shelf above the table. The cup is dented on one side, the result of a long-ago fall onto the hard-packed floor, and it warms your fingers even through the wool mitten you are still wearing on your left hand. You set the cup on the table near the scraper, where it will wait for you, and the steam rises from its surface in a thin, curling ribbon that twists and then flattens into nothing. You do not drink the tea right away. Instead, you stand by the window for a moment, the cup forgotten at your side, and you look out through the scraped hide at the world beyond. The scene has not changed since you checked it at dawn, and it will not change for weeks, perhaps months. The clearing around the post is a smooth white expanse that rises in gentle drifts against the base of the spruce trees, their branches so heavy with snow that they droop toward the ground in slow curves. Behind them the forest stretches away into a grey-white distance that has no visible end, a flat, frozen wilderness that seems to hold its breath under the weight of the cold. Nothing moves on the snow, not a track, not a shadow, and the sky above is a single unbroken sheet of cloud that diffuses the meager January light into a soft, directionless glow. Even the smoke from the stovepipe, which you can see from the corner of the window, rises straight up into the still air, a pale column that does not waver or bend, as if it too has been frozen in place. You stand there for a long, quiet moment, and the silence outside is so deep that you can almost feel it pressing against the walls of the cabin. A silence that is not empty, but full of the cold and the snow and the immense, patient darkness of the winter. Then you turn back to the bench and check the pelt. You press the leather side with the pad of your thumb, pushing gently near the edge where the hide is thinnest. It gives slightly, a soft resilience that was not there before, and the frost on the fur has begun to darken into tiny beads of moisture that catch the light. It is not yet ready. You know this because when you try to bend a corner between your fingers, it still resists with a brittle stiffness that tells you the deeper layers are still frozen. You let it lie, and you gather your other small tools, setting them out on the table in the order you will need them when the work begins. The whetstone you place at the top of the table, the scraper below it, a small clay pot of rendered tallow for greasing the blade if it begins to drag on the right, and a folded piece of coarse wool cloth for wiping on the left. Each object is placed with a calm, unhurried precision that has nothing to do with fussiness, and everything to do with the deep satisfaction of a space set right. A space where every movement will be efficient and easy and without waste. Now the tea is cool enough to drink, and you lift the cup to your lips and take a small sip. The taste is mild and slightly bitter, with a clean, woodsy aftertaste that lingers on your tongue, and it warms a path down your throat and into your chest, spreading outward like a slow, liquid fire. You drink it standing up, looking at the pelt on the bench, watching as the frost melts into tiny, glittering droplets that run down the sides of the fur and disappear into the wood. The smell of the damp hide, a rich, animal scent with undertones of cold water and musk, begins to fill the space around the stove, blending with the smoke of the spruce fire and the faint, metallic tang of the iron scraper. It is the smell of your winter, the smell of this work, and it is as familiar to you as your own breath. You finish the tea and set the empty cup back on the shelf, and then you pick up the whetstone and the scraper and give the blade a few more careful strokes, even though you know it is already sharp. This is a habit, a quiet ritual that settles your mind into the rhythm of the task ahead, and you find a small comfort in the repetition of it, the dip of the stone in water, the smooth, circular motion of your wrist, the soft metallic whispering sound that rises and falls with each pass. When you are satisfied, you wipe the blade clean with the wool cloth and hold it up to the light, though the light is too dim to show you much except a faint silver gleam. Then you set it down again, and you return to the bench to test the pelt once more. This time, when you press your thumb into the leather near the center of the hide, the indentation stays for a moment before slowly springing back, and when you lift the edge and try to bend it, it yields with a smooth, leathery flexibility that is just short of being fully pliable. It is ready, or nearly ready, and so you lift the pelt from the bench and carry it to the work table, draping it over the rounded end of the scraping beam with the flesh side facing up. The leather is now a pale, creamy tan, marked by the faint branching lines of the veins that once carried blood through the animal's body, and it feels cool and slightly damp against your fingertips. You adjust its position slightly, pulling it taut so that there are no wrinkles or folds, and then you pick up the scraper. But you do not begin to scrape. Instead, you pause with the blade resting against the top of the pelt, your hand light and your arm relaxed, and you let the quiet of the room settle around you once more. The fire murmurs in the stove, a low, steady sound that is almost like breathing, and the light from the window has brightened, just a little, the grey taking on a faint, milky quality that suggests the sun is somewhere above the clouds. The pelt waits, the tool waits, and you wait, and in this waiting there is no impatience, only the calm, patient stillness of a long winter morning that has nowhere to go and nothing to prove. The world outside is as motionless as stone, and inside, in the small circle of warmth and lamplight, there is only the quiet rhythm of the fire, and the slow, patient softening of the hide, and the taste of spruce tea still on your tongue, a small bitter warmth that lingers like the memory of summer in a place where summer has been forgotten. The scraper rests against the top edge of the pelt, its curved blade touching the pale leather with the lightness of a thought. You have not yet moved, because the moment before the first stroke is a kind of quiet that deserves its own small space, a pause in which the stillness of the cabin and the warmth of the stove and the weight of the tool in your hand all gather together into a single point of attention. The pelt lies draped over the scraping beam, its flesh side facing up, a landscape of faint veins and tiny imperfections that catch the firelight in delicate shifting lines. You breathe out slowly, and the mist of your breath drifts across the blade, and then you push. The first stroke is always the lightest, a testing pass that moves from the top of the hide, near where the neck would have been, down toward the center in a smooth, straight line. The blade whispers against the leather, a sound so soft that you feel it as much as you hear it, a delicate shushing that is like the sound of a hand passing over fine cloth. The iron does not bite deeply. It only grazes the surface, lifting a fine, almost invisible powder of dried membrane that disappears into the air before you can see it fall. You feel the resistance of the hide through the wooden handle, a subtle drag that tells you the blade is sharp and the angle is right and the pelt is ready to be worked. You pull the scraper back to the starting position, letting it hover just above the place where the stroke began, and then you make a second pass, overlapping the first by the width of a finger, pressing just a little more firmly this time. A thin, translucent curl of scraped matter rises from the blade and falls onto the apron spread across your lap, and the sound deepens into a low, steady rasp that settles into the room like a new voice in the quiet conversation between the fire and the walls. Your hand moves in a rhythm that belongs to a part of you that is older than memory, a pattern learned through so many repetitions that your wrist and your elbow and your shoulder all move without any instruction from your conscious mind. You push the scraper down the length of the pelt, draw it back, shift it slightly to the right, push again, draw it back, shift again, and each stroke cleans a narrow path through the thin, whitish layer that the butchers call the membrane, a delicate tissue that once held the beaver's skin to the layer of fat beneath. The motion is not mechanical in the way that a clock is mechanical. It is organic, a flowing series of adjustments that your body makes without your awareness, responding to the subtle changes in the texture of the hide, the slight variations in thickness from the center to the edge, the small scars and healed wounds that mark the place where the animal once lived and fought and moved through the cold water of the northern streams. The sound of the work changes as you move across the pelt. Near the center, where the hide is thickest and the membrane is densest, the scraper speaks in a lower, rougher tone, a drawn-out friction that you can feel in the bones of your forearm, while near the edges, where the leather tapers to a thin, almost translucent margin, the sound lightens into a papery whisper that barely disturbs the air. You work outward from the spine line in both directions, first to the left, then to the right, turning the pelt slightly on the beam as you go, so that each section lies flat and even under the blade. Your left hand holds the edge of the hide steady, keeping it taut without stretching it, and you can feel through your fingertips the gradual transformation as the membrane is removed, the leather becoming smoother and cleaner and more pliable with each pass. The scrapings collect on the apron in a small, growing mound, pale grey and slightly waxy, and the scent of them, a clean animal smell with a faint undertone of the cold water that once soaked this hide, rises up to blend with the wood smoke and the spruce tea and the warm, oily fragrance of the stove. You do not count the strokes, because there is no number that would mean anything. The work is done when it is done, when the flesh side of the pelt is uniform in color and texture from edge to edge, when no white patches of remaining membrane catch the light, when your fingertips pass over the surface and feel only the fine, velvety grain of properly cleaned leather. You pause occasionally, not to rest, but to assess, letting the scraper lie across your lap while you run your palm over the area you have just worked, checking for any spots that need a second attention. Your palm knows the language of the hide, reading the tiny bumps and ridges that your eyes might miss in the dim cabin light. And when you find a place where the membrane is still clinging, you return the blade to that exact spot and work it with short, careful strokes that blend into the surrounding area without leaving a mark. It is patient, meticulous work, the kind of work that cannot be hurried, and there is a calm satisfaction in the way each small imperfection is found and corrected, the pelt moving toward its finished state as slowly and as steadily as the winter day itself. The fire settles lower in the stove, and without interrupting the rhythm of your scraping, you are aware of the change in the warmth on the side of your face, the way the heat no longer presses against your cheek with the same insistence. You finish the section you are working on, a long curving stroke that follows the contour of the pelt's flank, and then you set the scraper down on the table, the blade angled carefully upward so it will not dull itself against the wood, and you rise to tend the stove. The floorboards creak under your weight in a voice you know, a voice that speaks of the cold that has crept back into the room while you were absorbed in your work, and you kneel before the stove and open the door to find the coals still glowing but sunken. The pyramid of bright orange that you built earlier now collapsed into a flatter, darker bed. You add 2 sticks of spruce, placing them parallel to each other with a space between for the air to move, and you watch as the flames find the new wood, licking upward in slow, lazy curls that cast dancing shadows on the dark logs of the walls. The stove's murmur returns to its full voice, a low, steady hum that fills the silence, and you stand for a moment with the warmth washing over your face and hands, letting the heat soak into the small muscles of your lower back, which have grown tight from leaning over the beam. Then you return to the table, picking up the scraper and wiping the blade with the wool cloth to remove the small accumulation of grease and membrane that has begun to dull its edge. The cloth is dark with use, soft and frayed at the edges, and it leaves the iron gleaming with a faint, oily sheen that will help the blade glide more smoothly through the remaining work. You reposition the pelt on the beam, turning it so that the lower portion, which you have not yet touched, lies uppermost, and you begin again. the first stroke on this fresh section making the same soft, whispering sound that the very first stroke of the morning made, as if the pelt has no memory and must be introduced to the scraper all over again. The membrane here is slightly thicker, the result of the animal's winter fat that gathered near the base of the tail, and it requires more pressure and slower strokes, each pass removing a wider, more substantial curl that falls with a soft, almost inaudible patter onto the growing pile in your lap. You adjust the angle of the blade almost imperceptibly, tilting the handle a degree or two towards you, and the change opens the cutting edge to the hide in a way that makes the work easier. The scraper biting cleanly, without tearing or dragging, and you settle into this adjusted rhythm with the same quiet absorption as before. The light from the window has not changed in any way that you could describe, and yet you sense that the morning has moved forward, that the pale grey glow has shifted slightly in its quality, becoming perhaps a fraction thinner, more diffuse, as the sun climbs toward the low invisible arc that is all it can manage at this latitude and this time of year. The shadows in the corners of the room have softened, the hard edges blurring into the general dimness, and the hanging pelts that you hooped yesterday sway on their strings in a movement so slight that it is more a vibration than a motion, a response to the minute currents of warm air that rise from the stove and spread out under the low ceiling. You do not look up to watch them, you are watching the blade, the pelt, the steady progress of the clean surface that extends inch by inch across the hide, and your mind drifts without destination, floating on the repetitive sound of the scraping and the warmth of the fire and the deep, abiding quiet that holds the world outside in its frozen palm. The feeling of the work changes as you move closer to the edge of the pelt. Here, where the leather is thin and delicate, you must use a lighter touch, letting the weight of the scraper do the work, rather than adding any pressure from your arm. The blade skims over the surface with a high, thin sound, almost a whistle, and the membrane comes away in tiny, fragmented flakes that look like the dust you might find on a moth's wing. You slow down, taking each stroke with the deliberate care that belongs to the end of a task, the final passes that will leave the pelt completely clean and ready for the next stage. This is the most exacting part of the work, because a slip here, a moment of inattention, could tear the thin leather or scrape it too thin, creating a weak spot that would show when the pelt is stretched on the hoop. But you do not slip, because your hands know this edge as well as they know the thick center, and they adjust without your having to think about it. The scraper lightening and slowing and finally stopping with the blade resting on the very margin of the hide where the fur begins. You lift the scraper and set it aside, and then you flip the pelt over on the beam so that the fur side faces up. The fur is dense and glossy, a deep chestnut brown with lighter tips that shimmer when the light catches them, and you run your hand over it slowly, feeling the soft, oily resilience of the individual guard hairs and the thick, woolly underfur beneath. You are not checking for flaws so much as you are paying a small, wordless respect to the material itself, the thing that gives the pelt its value and its beauty. The fur is clean, free of mats or burrs or the tiny ice crystals that sometimes cling to the belly fur when the pelt was frozen too quickly, and so you fold the pelt carefully, fur side in, and set it on the growing pile of finished hides that rests on the clean sack beside the table. The pile is still small, only a few pelts high, but it will grow as the day moves forward, and by evening it will be substantial enough to press and bind and store for the spring. You wipe your hands on your apron, feeling the slight stickiness of the rendered membrane that has transferred itself to your fingers, and you take a sip of the tea, which has gone almost completely cold. The cold tea tastes different, more bitter and more mineral, but it wets your throat, which has become dry from the hours of breathing the warm, dry air of the stove, and you drink it down in 2 slow swallows before setting the cup aside. The next pelt waits on the warming bench, where it has been thawing during this whole passage of time, and you press it with your thumb and find it exactly right, pliable but still cool, the perfect temperature for the scraper. You lift it and carry it to the beam and drape it into place, adjusting its position with the same small, precise movements you used on the first one, and then you pick up the scraper and touch its blade to the top of the new hide, ready to begin the cycle again. And the quiet sound of the first stroke, light and tentative and full of the patience of the long winter, fills the room once more, a sound as constant and as calming as the slow drift of snow against the frozen world outside. The first pelt of the morning is finished and folded and set aside, and you do not pause to admire the work because there is no need to admire what has been done 1,000 times before. You simply reach for the next frozen pelt on the warming bench, the one that has been lying there since you first built up the fire, and you lift it with both hands, feeling the familiar weight and the stubborn cold that still clings to its center, despite the gentle heat that has been working its way through the leather for the past hour. The rhythm of this day does not stop between one hide and the next. It only shifts slightly, like a current in a slow river that moves around a stone and then reforms on the other side. The same water traveling toward the same distant sea. You drape the new pelt over the scraping beam, settling it into place with a few small adjustments of your fingers, pulling it taut at the edges so that the surface is smooth and free of any wrinkles that might catch the blade, and then you pick up the scraper, its wooden handle warm from your grip, and its iron blade still carrying the faint, oily sheen of the tallow you used to dress it. The first stroke on this new hide is the same as the first stroke on the hide before it, a light testing pass that travels from the top of the leather down toward the center, lifting a fine, almost invisible powder of dried membrane that drifts into the air and settles slowly onto the table. The apron, your hands. The sound the scraper makes is soft and steady, a low shushing that seems to come from a great distance, even though it is happening right beneath your palms. And as you draw the blade back and begin the second stroke, overlapping the first by the width of a finger, you feel yourself settling more deeply into the work, your body finding the easy, unhurried posture that will carry you through the long middle hours of the day. This is the rhythm of repetition, the quiet heart of the fur trade post, where time is measured not by the ticking of a clock, but by the slow accumulation of scrapings in the wooden bowl at your elbow, and the gradual shrinking of the stack of unworked pelts on the bench. The bowl is a simple thing, carved from a burl of birch, its rim darkened by years of handling, and its interior stained with the pale, waxy residue of countless membranes scraped from countless hides. When you emptied it at the start of the day, it was clean and light, but now, as you work through the second pelt and then the third, a thin layer of greyish, powdery matter begins to coat its bottom. The first evidence that the morning is moving forward, even though the light in the window has not changed and the stove hums on, as it always does. You do not watch the bowl or track its fullness. You simply notice it from time to time, the way you notice the growth of shadows or the cooling of tea. A small marker that drifts through your awareness and then recedes, leaving you to the steady rocking motion of the scraper against the hide. The pelts themselves are each slightly different, though the method you apply to them never varies. One is a deep, rich chocolate brown, its fur so dense that your fingers sink into it when you lift it from the bench, and its leather side is thick and firm, requiring a heavier hand and a slower stroke to peel away the stubborn membrane. Another is a paler, silvery chestnut, lighter in weight and thinner in the hide, and the scraper glides over it with a quicker, whispery sound, removing the tissue in long, translucent ribbons that curl around the blade like paper. A third has a small, healed scar on its flank, a pale line where the animal once caught itself on a sharp branch or the tooth of a rival, and you work around this place with the same care you bring to the edges, lightening your pressure so that the leather won't tear along the old wound. Each pelt has its own character, its own small history written in the grain of its skin and the pattern of its fur. That the process you follow is the same for everyone. Lift, drape, scrape the flesh side, flip, check for remaining patches, fold loosely, set aside, reach for the next. This flowing sequence of motions becomes a kind of quiet music as the morning deepens, a music that has no melody, but only a steady, repeating rhythm that rocks you gently in its current. Your body knows this rhythm so well that your mind is free to drift, not to any particular destination, but simply outward, floating on the edge of awareness like a leaf on still water. You think of nothing much, the color of the sky, the taste of the spruce tea, the sound of your husband's snowshoes crunching on the frozen crust when he left the cabin before dawn, a sound that faded into the silence so completely that you can no longer recall exactly when it stopped. These thoughts pass through your mind without leaving any trace, as light and as transient as the steam from the kettle, and you continue to scrape stroke after stroke, your hands moving in their ancient, learned pattern, while the cabin wraps itself around you like a well-worn blanket. The stove requires your attention at some point, though you could not say exactly when, because the fire has a way of letting you know without urgency, the warmth on your cheek thinning just enough that you notice the absence rather than the need. You finish the section you're working on, a long, sweeping curve across the belly of a particularly large pelt, and then you set the scraper down and walk to the stove, your footsteps making the floorboards speak in low, familiar voices. You open the heavy iron door and look inside, where the coals are still bright but sunken, their orange fading to grey at the edges, and you add 2 pieces of wood, placing them with the same careful attention you bring to everything else, angling them so the air can move freely through the flames. The fresh wood catches almost immediately, the fire lifting with a soft, breathy sound that is almost a contented sigh, and you close the door and adjust the vent and stand there for a moment, letting the renewed heat wash over your face and chest and hands, feeling the stiffness ease out of the small muscles between your shoulder blades. Then you return to the work table, and in the small pause that follows, the stillness of the world outside rushes in to fill the space left by the stopped scraper. It is not a loud stillness, it is not a presence that announces itself. It is simply there, a deep, absolute quiet that presses against the walls of the cabin and the oiled window and the heavy wooden door with a patience that has no end. You can hear, in that pause, the things that are usually hidden beneath the sound of your work. The remote creak of a floorboard contracting in the cold, the soft sigh of the windless air moving through the stovepipe, the almost inaudible settling of the snow against the base of the walls. Even the spruce trees outside seem to be holding their breath, their sap frozen solid in the deep chill, their branches as still as if they were carved from stone. It is a quiet so complete that it almost has a texture, a smooth, heavy presence that fills the ears and the mind with a calm that is deeper than sleep. You stand in this quiet for a moment, letting it soak into you like water into dry cloth, and then you reach up and push a strand of hair back beneath the edge of your linen cap, a small, habitual gesture that your hands have made 1,000 times without your ever deciding to do it. The hair is damp at the temple from the warmth of the stove, and the cap is slightly askew, and you straighten it with a quick, efficient motion that belongs to the same rhythm as the scraping, a rhythm of small adjustments and small attentions that fill the hours without haste. Then you wipe the blade of the scraper with the wool rag, removing the thin film of grease that has built up from the last pelt, and you look at the stack of unworked hides on the bench and see that it is now noticeably smaller than it was when you began, though you could not say how many you have finished, because you have not been counting. The counting is not necessary. The work is done when it is done, and the day will hold as many pelts as it holds, and no amount of tallying will change the slow, steady pace of the hours. You lift the next pelt from the bench, a dark, almost black beaver with silver tips that shimmer in the dim light, and you drape it over the beam and begin again. The scraper finds its path, the membrane peels away, the scrapings fall into the bowl, and the quiet rhythm of repetition resumes, as steady as breathing, as constant as the cold. Your hands move through the same sequence of motions, your body rocking slightly with each stroke, and the sound of the work fills the room once more, blending with the murmur of the stove and the soft creak of the cabin walls and the deep, patient silence of the winter world outside. The morning moves forward, and the pile of finished pelts grows, and the bowl of scrapings fills by slow degrees, and you continue on, unhurried and calm, carried by the simple, endless rhythm of the task. The workroom grows familiar around you in the way that a very old friend grows familiar, not through any single quality that can be named, but through the slow accumulation of small, constant things. You have been scraping pelts for several hours now, and your hands have found a rhythm so steady that you no longer notice the individual strokes, only the continuous gentle motion of the blade against the hide and the soft patter of the scrapings as they fall into the wooden bowl. The cabin has warmed to a temperature that is still cool by any ordinary measure, but that feels almost comfortable against the deep chill pressing in from outside, and the stove hums its low, steady hum, a sound that has become so much a part of the room that you would miss it if it stopped, though it never stops. What changes, so gradually that the change is more a growing awareness than a distinct event, is the light. The oiled hide window, stretched tight across its wooden frame and sewn with sinew along the edges, admits a pale, greyish-white glow that has been present since the beginning of the day, but now, as the sun somewhere far above the clouds begins its shallow, invisible descent across the sky. That glow shifts slightly in its quality, becoming thinner and more diffuse, a light that seems to come from everywhere at once rather than from any particular direction. It is a winter light, flat and soft and without shadows. A light that makes the edges of things blur gently into the dim air, and it moves across the room with a slowness that is almost imperceptible, sliding along the rough-hewn surface of the work table and touching the dark iron of the stove and glinting faintly on the rim of the tin cup that still holds the dregs of your cold tea. You notice the way the light catches the edge of the scraper as you work, making the iron gleam with a dull silver sheen that was not visible in the earlier dimness. It is not a bright gleam. It is a quiet, restrained spark that appears and disappears with each stroke, a tiny flash that lives for a moment on the cutting edge and then vanishes as the blade moves into a different angle. You do not pause to watch it, but your eyes register it all the same, the way they register the other small inhabitants of the room that had been your silent companions through every winter you have spent at this post. The workroom is not empty, though it contains only you and the fire and the pelts. It is filled with objects that carry the memory of other days and other winters, and each one has its own place, its own quiet presence that contributes to the feeling of deep, settled calm that fills the space like water filling a basin. Above the stove, on a rough mantel made from a single split log, rests a clay pipe that belongs to your husband. It is a simple pipe, its stem slightly crooked from years of use, its bowl darkened by the countless small fires that have burned inside it, and it sits next to a small tin of tobacco that is almost empty, its lid slightly ajar. You see it every time you tend the fire, a familiar shape that you do not need to look at directly to know is there, and it carries with it the faint, sweet smell of the tobacco that lingers even when the pipe is cold. Beside the pipe, hanging from a crooked nail that was driven into the log many years before you came to this place, is a bundle of dried sweetgrass, its pale green blades twisted together into a loose braid and tied with a scrap of red wool. The sweetgrass has lost much of its scent over the months, but if you lean close to it, you can still detect a faint, grassy sweetness that reminds you of the brief, intense summer when the meadows along the bay burst into green for a few short weeks before the frost returned. You do not lean close to it now because you are working, but you know it is there, and the knowing is enough. In the corner near the door, 3 willow hoops lean against the rough log wall, their bent forms casting thin, curved shadows that shift almost imperceptibly as the light moves. These are the hoops that you will use later to stretch the finished pelts, and you have placed them there so that they will be within easy reach when the time comes. The willow from which they were made was cut in the autumn, when the sap was low and the branches were pliable, and each hoop was bent into its circular shape and tied with sinew and left to dry until it held its curve as firmly as if it had grown that way. The wood is smooth and pale, with small knots that show as darker patches, and the sinew bindings are tight and even, the work of your own hands on a quiet autumn afternoon that now seems very far away. You do not think about that afternoon in any detail, but the memory of it is there, folded into the presence of the hoops themselves, and it adds another layer to the calm that surrounds you. The stack of firewood beside the stove has been slowly diminishing since the early morning, and you notice this without concern, because the stack is still more than sufficient for the day and the night and the next day, and there is more wood in the lean-to outside the door, split and stacked and frozen solid, waiting to be brought in when it is needed. The logs at the top of the pile are dry and grey, their bark curling slightly at the edges, while those at the bottom are darker with the moisture that seeps up from the cold floor. But all of them are good, seasoned spruce that will burn hot and slow and clean, and you take comfort in the solid, reliable presence of them, the way they promise warmth and light without asking for anything in return. On a small ledge near the window, a grease lamp burns with a flame so small and steady that it is more a bead of light than a fire. The lamp is a simple thing, a shallow stone dish filled with rendered bear fat into which a twisted strip of mosswick has been set, and it gives off a faint, warm glow that barely illuminates the wall behind it, but that fills the room with the soft, savoury smell of burning tallow. The smell mixes with the other smells of the workroom, the clean, animal scent of the beaver pelts, the sharp, metallic tang of the scraper, the resinous sweetness of the spruce smoke, and the faint, earthy odour of the clay floor that has been packed hard by years of footsteps. Together, these smells form a rich, quiet perfume that is the scent of winter itself, a scent that you breathe in with every slow, even breath, and that you will remember years from now as the smell of home. You pause in your work, straightening your back slowly, feeling the vertebrae settle into a slightly different alignment after the long hours of leaning forward over the beam. Your shoulders roll backward in a gentle automatic motion, and the small muscles across your upper back stretch and release, a quiet sensation that is not pain, but only the awareness of your body returning itself to balance. You lift your head and look around the room, not to search for anything, but simply to let your eyes rest on the familiar shapes and shadows. And you listen. The silence is still there, as deep and as complete as it has been all day, a silence that is not broken by the sound of the stove or the small hiss of the grease lamp, but only made more noticeable by these tiny noises, the way a single star seems brighter against a dark sky. You hear the faint, almost inaudible tick of the cooling logs in the stove, the soft creak of a rafter expanding slightly in the warmth, the distant, imagined sound of the cold itself pressing against the walls like a great, patient hand. There is no wind, no bird, no voice but the voice of the cabin settling into itself, and you feel the solitude of the post not as loneliness, but as a kind of spaciousness, a room large enough to hold all the quiet you could ever need. Then you return to the scraper, picking it up from where it rested on the table, its handle still warm from your palm, and you wipe the blade with the wool rag, which is now flecked with small greyish specks of dried membrane that cling to the fibers. You turn your attention back to the pelt on the beam, a medium-sized beaver with fur of a soft, reddish-brown that glows almost copper in the lamplight, and you check your progress by running your fingertips over the flesh side, feeling the smooth, clean texture of the properly worked leather and the slight roughness at the very edge where the membrane still clings. You settle the blade into position and resume scraping, the sound of the work picking up again as if it had never stopped, a soft, continuous shushing that flows into the other sounds of the room and becomes part of the larger quiet. The light continues its slow, silent migration across the table as you work, sliding from the center toward the far edge, where it will eventually fall onto the floor and then climb the opposite wall and finally fade into the blue-gray twilight of the afternoon. You are aware of this movement without watching it directly, the way you are aware of the warmth of the stove or the weight of your own hands, and it gives a shape to the day that is not measured in hours, but in the gradual, gentle progression of shadow and glow. The pelts that you have been scraping take their turns on the warming bench, each one waiting in the gentle heat until its frozen stiffness loosens into a pliable softness, and then moving to the beam to be cleaned, and then joining the growing pile of finished hides on the sack beside the table. The rotation is slow and steady, a quiet cycle that turns without hurry, and you move through it with the same patience you bring to every part of this winter day. The pile of finished pelts has now grown to a height that you could measure with your hand if you were inclined to measure, but you are not, and so you simply note its presence as you reach for the next frozen hide, a smaller pelt that was likely taken from a young beaver in its second year. The fur is softer and finer than that of the older animals, a pale silvery brown that feels almost like down under your fingers, and the leather is thin and delicate, requiring an even lighter touch than usual. You adjust the angle of the scraper, holding it almost flat against the hide, and you work with short, feathery strokes that barely disturb the surface, the sound so faint that it is more a feeling than a noise. The work on this pelt takes longer, not because it is difficult, but because it requires more attention, a slower pace that matches the fineness of the material, and you give it that attention willingly, letting the minutes flow past without counting them. When the pelt is finished and folded and added to the pile, you stretch your fingers, curling them inward and then extending them outward, feeling the slight ache in the joints that comes from gripping the wooden handle for so long. The ache is familiar and not unpleasant, a small reminder of the work done, and it fades quickly as you shake out your hands and then reach for the next pelt, which is already waiting, already softened to exactly the right consistency. The bowl of scrapings is now nearly full, the pale, waxy matter heaped slightly above the rim, and you will need to empty it soon, carrying it to the refuse bucket that sits in the attached fur store. But you decide to finish one more pelt before you do, because there is no hurry and because the afternoon has not yet begun to darken, and because the warmth of the room and the rhythm of the work are holding you in a calm, suspended state that you have no desire to break. You scrape on, and the light slides another inch across the table, touching the edge of the scraper again with a dull silver gleam, and the grease lamp flickers almost imperceptibly as a tiny draught moves through the room and then is gone, and the bundle of dried sweet grass sways gently on its nail, and the clay pipe on the mantel remains as still as it has been all day, holding its small silent shape against the dark wood. The workroom endures, filled with the quiet companionship of its objects and the steady, patient sound of the scraper, a sound that has no beginning and no end, but simply continues, as constant and as calming as the deep, soft snow that covers the world outside. The decision to stop for a meal does not arrive as a sudden thought, but rather as a slow, quiet recognition that rises from somewhere deep in your body, a sense that the morning has stretched itself out long enough and that the warmth you have been spending on the pelts needs to be replenished with a different kind of warmth. You finish the stroke you're making, drawing the scraper down the last few inches of the pelt with a smooth, unhurried motion, and then you lift the blade away and set it down on the table, angling it carefully so the edge does not touch the wood. The sound of the scraping stops, and in its absence the other sounds of the room come forward, the soft hum of the stove, the faint hiss of the grease lamp, the almost inaudible tick of the cabin walls settling into the cold. You straighten your back slowly, feeling the vertebrae move one by one into a more upright position, and you press your palms against the small of your back, stretching the muscles that have been held in the same gentle curve for a long while. Your hands are stained with the faint greyish residue of the membrane scrapings, and you wipe them on your apron, which is now marked with a map of the morning's labour, pale patches and dark smudges that tell the story of every pelt you have worked. The apron is made of heavy linen, its surface rough and soft at the same time, and it hangs from your shoulders and ties at your waist with a simple cord, and it has been your companion through so many winter days that you have stopped seeing it as a separate thing, the way you have stopped seeing your own hands. You cross to the stove, your footsteps making the floorboards speak in their low, familiar voices, and you kneel before the iron door with the same patient attention you gave it at dawn. The fire has burned down again, not to ash but to a bed of deep orange coals that glow with a steady, quiet light, and you take the slim iron rod that hangs from a hook beside the stove and stir the coals gently, breaking apart the ones that are fused together and bringing the brighter ones to the surface. The coals respond with a soft, crackling sigh, and a few small flames, pale blue at the base and yellow at the tips, flicker upward from the disturbed ash, dancing for a moment before settling back into the steady glow. You reach for the woodpile and select 2 sticks of dry spruce, about the thickness of your thumb, and you lay them across the coals in a loose cross pattern, leaving space between them for the air to move. And then you add a slightly larger piece, a split log with bark still clinging to one edge, placing it on top so that it will catch more slowly and burn for a longer time. The flames find the new wood almost immediately, licking up the sides with a soft, breathy sound, and the warmth pushes outward against your face and hands, a dry, clean heat that feels like a welcome, even though you have been warm enough all morning. You close the stove door and adjust the vent, opening it just a little more than before to give the new fire the air it needs, and then you rise, your knees making the same soft sound against the floorboards that they made when you knelt. On the back corner of the stove, where the heat is steady but not intense, a small covered pot has been sitting since early morning. It is a simple iron pot, blackened by smoke and grease, its lid slightly askew from where you last checked it, and when you lift the lid a thin curl of steam rises into the cooler air, carrying with it the mild, nutty smell of hulled barley that has been slowly cooking into a soft, thick porridge. You stir the porridge with a long wooden spoon, the grain moving sluggishly against the bottom of the pot, and then you reach into a small clay jar that sits on the shelf above the stove and take a pinch of dried blueberries, the last of the autumn's harvest, their skin wrinkled and dark and faintly sticky. You drop the berries into the porridge and stir them through, watching as they release a faint purple color into the pale grain, a small, quiet bloom of summer in the middle of the deep freeze. Then you ladle a portion into a wooden bowl that you take from its hook on the wall, a bowl carved from a burl of birch, its rim darkened by use and its interior smooth by the passage of countless spoons, and you stand by the window with the bowl cupped in both hands, letting the warmth of the porridge soak into your palms. The window shows you the same world it has shown you all day, a world made of snow and the dark shapes of spruce trees and the low, flat sky that hangs over everything like a pale grey blanket. Nothing has moved since you last looked, and nothing will move for hours yet, perhaps for days. The snow in the clearing is smooth and unbroken, its surface textured with the faint rippling patterns that the wind left behind some days ago. A wind that has now vanished entirely, leaving the air so still that the smoke from the stovepipe rises in a perfectly straight column, pale against the grey, not bending or wavering, as if it has been painted onto the sky. The spruce trees stand in their patient rows, their branches heavy with the accumulated weight of a month of snowfall, and the forest behind them fades into a soft, blue-grey distance that has no visible end, a wilderness that stretches to a frozen sea, and then beyond, into a silence that is larger than any one person could hold. You eat the porridge standing up, spoonful after slow spoonful, and the taste of it is mild and earthy, the barley softened to a creamy consistency, and the berries adding small bursts of faint sweetness that linger on your tongue for a moment and then fade. The warmth of the food travels down your throat and spreads outward into your chest and your stomach, a gentle spreading heat that feels different from the heat of the stove, more internal and more personal, a warmth that belongs to you alone. You do not rush the eating because there is no reason to rush, and the standing by the window has become a small ritual of its own, a pause in the rhythm of the day that allows you to inhabit the quiet, without the accompaniment of the scraper, to simply be still and watch the unchanging world, and let the food settle. When the bowl is empty, you scrape the last traces of porridge from the sides with the edge of the spoon, a sound that is soft and wooden and brief, and then you take the bowl and the spoon to the small bucket of water that sits on the floor near the door. The water is cold, so cold that it makes your fingers ache when you dip them in, but you wash the bowl quickly, using a scrap of cloth to wipe away the residue of the meal, and you rinse the spoon and set them both on a small shelf to dry. The cloth you wring out and hang over the edge of the bucket where it will freeze slightly before you need it again, and then you dry your hands on your apron, feeling the cold water evaporate from your skin into the dry, warm air of the cabin. You turn back to the stove and check the fire, opening the door just enough to see that the new wood has caught well and is burning with a strong, steady flame, and then you push the kettle, which has been sitting at the back of the stove, directly over the heat so that the water inside will boil again, and you can make fresh tea for the afternoon. The kettle is heavy and black, and it settles onto the hot iron with a soft, metallic sound, and a new thread of steam begins to rise from its spout, thin and pale and twisting slightly, in the moving air above the stove. Then you look at the warming bench, where the next pelt has been lying since you placed it there before the meal, and you press it with your thumb, feeling the soft, pliable give that tells you it is perfectly thawed, ready to be worked, and you lift it and carry it to the table, draping it over the beam with the same small, precise adjustments you have made a dozen times already today. You pick up the scraper, its wooden handle fitting into your palm with the comfortable familiarity of a handshake, and you touch the blade to the top edge of the new pelt. The pause that was the meal is over now, dissolved back into the steady flow of the day, and you begin the first stroke, light and testing, the blade whispering against the leather with a sound that is as soft as the first sound you made this morning. The rhythm resumes, and the quiet of the room closes around you again, and the afternoon ahead is long and calm and filled with the same patient, repetitive work that has carried you through every winter day you can remember. A work that asks nothing of you but your attention and gives back a stillness so deep that it feels like rest even while your hands are moving. The scraping of the day's pelts is finished now, and the last of the cleaned hides lies folded on the pile beside the work table, its flesh side smooth and even, and its fur side soft and glossy in the dim light of the grease lamp. You have been working since before the grey dawn, and your hands know the shape of the scraper's handle as intimately as they know the shape of your own fingers. But the day is not yet done, because a pelt that has been scraped is only half prepared, still too loose and too damp to be packed for the company's bundles, still needing to be stretched and dried and set into its final, perfect flatness. The stretching is a different kind of work, quieter even than the scraping, slower and more delicate, and it requires its own set of tools and its own patient rhythm, and you turn toward it now with the same calm attention you have brought to every task since you rose from your bed in the cold loft. The willow hoops lean against the wall near the table, exactly where you placed them this morning, their pale, curved shapes catching the firelight in thin, golden lines along their edges. You reach for the first hoop and lift it with both hands, feeling the lightness of the dried willow, the smoothness of the bark that you peeled away months ago when the branches were still green and pliable, and the tightness of the sinew binding that holds the circle closed. The hoop is about the width of your outstretched arms, a perfect ring that has been bent and tied and left to season until it became as rigid as iron, and it will serve as the frame upon which the beaver pelt will be laced and stretched until it dries into a flat, even disc of leather and fur, ready for the fur press and the long journey to the London market. You set the hoop on the table, leaning it against the edge so that it stands upright within easy reach, and then you turn to the pile of scraped pelts and select the one that is driest, the one you finished earliest in the morning and that has been resting the longest. It is a medium-sized pelt, a rich dark brown in color, and its leather side is cool and smooth to the touch, still slightly damp from the membrane scraping, but no longer wet, pliable enough to stretch without tearing. You carry it to the table and lay it flat, fur side down, and you begin the quiet, methodical work of preparing it for the hoop. The process of stretching a beaver pelt begins with the edges. Around the perimeter of the hide, spaced at regular intervals, there are small holes that you punched earlier in the season when the pelt was first fleshed and salted. A ring of tiny perforations that will hold the lacing string. You check each hole now, running your fingertip around the circle of the pelt and feeling for any that might have torn or closed up during the scraping, and you find them all intact, small neat punctures that you're all made on a different quiet morning, much like this one. Satisfied, you reach for the coil of sinew that lies on the table, a long pale thread that you prepared from the backstrap of a deer, stripped and cleaned and twisted and left to dry until it became as strong and as fine as any cord you could buy from the company store. The sinew is slightly stiff from the cold, but it warms quickly in your hand, becoming flexible and easy to work with, and you uncoil a length of it and measure it against the circumference of the hoop, adding extra for the knots and the lacing, and then you cut it with the small knife that you keep in a sheath at your waist. Now you lift the pelt and position it inside the hoop, centering it carefully so that the spine line runs straight and the fur side faces downward, away from you. The leather side looks up, pale and clean, and you begin to lace the pelt to the willow frame. You pass the end of the sinew through one of the holes at what you judge to be the top of the pelt, drawing it through with a slow, steady pull until a short tail remains on the underside, and then you loop the sinew around the hoop and back through the same hole, creating a simple, secure knot that holds the hide in place. You do not pull it tight yet. You only seat it, letting the pelt hang loosely from the frame while you move to the next hole, which is a few inches along the edge, and then the next, working your way around the circle with the same even, unhurried pace you used for the scraping. The lacing is a quiet, repetitive motion that has its own gentle rhythm, a rhythm of threading and looping and drawing through, of moving the sinew around the willow and back into the leather, of cinching each point just enough to hold, but not yet to stretch. Your hands move in a steady, clockwise progression, and the sinew follows them like a pale, slender snake, weaving the pelt into the circle of the hoop, with a series of small, neat stitches that will soon be tightened into a perfect, even tension. The sound of the work is very soft, the faint whisper of the sinew sliding through the holes, the occasional light tap of the hoop against the table when you shift it, the quiet creak of the willow as it takes the weight of the hide. It is a sound that belongs to the later part of the day, when the scraping is done and the light has begun its slow fade toward the blue hour of the afternoon. When you have laced the sinew through every hole around the entire circumference of the pelt, you return to the starting point and begin the true work of stretching. You take the tail of sinew that you left at the first hole and pull it gently, drawing the pelt outward toward the edge of the hoop, and you watch the leather respond, the slight puckering around the hole smoothing out as the hide begins to spread itself flat. You move to the next loop and pull it with the same gentle pressure, and then the next, working your way around the circle in a slow spiral of adjustment, each pull adding a little more tension, a little more evenness, until the pelt is suspended within the hoop like a drumhead, its surface smooth and taut and free of any wrinkle or fold. This is the most delicate part of the stretching, because too much tension in one place will distort the shape of the pelt, pulling it into an oval or creating a thin spot that will weaken the leather, while too little tension will leave the hide loose and rippled, a poor specimen for the company's inspectors. You know the right tension by feel, a certain springiness under your fingers, a certain evenness of resistance that runs through the sinew and into the willow and tells you that the hide is stretched exactly as it should be. You check your work by running your palm flat over the surface of the leather, feeling for any unevenness, any subtle dip or rise that might indicate a problem. The leather is cool and smooth, and your hand passes over it without catching, the way it would pass over a well-planed board or a piece of fine cloth. You pause at one point where the tension seems slightly less than the rest, a spot near the flank where the hide is naturally thinner, and you give the corresponding sinew loop an extra careful pull, watching the leather draw taut and then hold, perfectly even with the surrounding surface. Then you tie off the sinew with a small secure knot, trimming the excess with your knife and tucking the end under one of the loops so that it will not catch on anything, and the pelt is ready to be hung. You lift the hoop carefully, holding it by the top edge where the willow is thickest, and you carry it to the open space near the stove where a number of strings hang down from the low ceiling rafters. These strings are simple lengths of hemp cord tied to wooden pegs that were driven into the logs long ago, and they hang down at regular intervals, each one waiting to hold a hooped pelt while it dries. You slip the top of the willow hoop onto one of the loops of cord, adjusting it so that the hoop hangs level and stable, and then you step back and watch as the pelt begins to turn slowly in the gentle, rising warmth from the stove. The rotation is so slow that you can barely see it, a motion that is more a suggestion than a fact, but it is there, the hoop swaying gently on its string, and the leather catches the firelight in a soft golden glow that seems to come from within the hide itself. You return to the table and begin the same process with the next pelt, a slightly larger one with fur of a silvery pale brown that shimmers under the grease lamp. You lace it onto a fresh hoop, working your way around the circle with the same steady, clockwise progression, your hands moving through the familiar motions while your mind drifts in the quiet, suspended space that the afternoon has become. The light from the window has deepened just slightly, the flat grey taking on a faint bluish undertone that signals the slow approach of the early winter dusk, though dusk is still hours away and the sun has not yet touched the invisible horizon. You pull each sinew loop carefully, evenly, until this pelt too is stretched as taut as the first, and then you tie it off and carry it to the rafters and hang it beside its companion, where the two hoops now sway gently together, their pelts slowly drying in the warm, dry air that rises continuously from the stove. The work continues in this way, pelt by pelt, hoop by hoop, and the quiet of the cabin becomes a little deeper with each one you hang. The hoops, when you look up at them, form a kind of canopy above your head, a floating circle of pale leather and pale wood, each one turning almost imperceptibly on its cord, catching the light and then releasing it, casting soft, moving shadows on the dark ceiling beams. The scent of the drying hides is clean and mild, a smell of leather and fur and the faint sweet residue of the willow bark, and it mixes with the wood smoke and the tallow and the steam from the kettle, which is now singing a low, steady note as the water inside approaches a boil. You work your way through the pile of finished pelts, and the number of hoops hanging from the rafters grows from 2 to 3 to 4, a quiet inventory of the day's labor that needs no tallying. Each pelt is slightly different in its stretching because each hide has its own subtle variation in thickness and shape and the way it responds to the tension of the sinew, and you adjust your pull accordingly on each one, giving a little more pressure to a thicker section or a little less to an edge that threatens to tear. But the variations are small, and your hands handle them without your needing to think about them. The lacing and the pulling and the knotting and the hanging repeat in a slow, steady cycle, a rhythm that is as calming as the rhythm of the scraper, and perhaps even more so, because the work of stretching is quieter, softer, more like a lullaby than a song. The kettle comes to a full boil while you are tying off the 5th pelt, and you pause to move it aside so that the water will not boil away into steam and leave the iron dry. You wrap a cloth around the handle, which is hot enough to burn, and you lift the kettle and set it on the cooler edge of the stove, where it will stay hot without bubbling, and then you pour yourself a fresh cup of spruce tea, the liquid dark and fragrant, and you stand for a moment with the cup in your hands, looking up at the hooped pelts that now fill the space near the stove with their slow, silent rotation. The steam from the tea rises past your face, and the warmth of the cup spreads into your palms, and the quiet of the cabin settles around you like a second blanket, heavy and soft and full of the deep patience of the winter. Then you set down the cup and return to the table, where a few pelts still remain, waiting to be stretched. You select the next, a small pelt from a young beaver, its fur fine and soft, and its leather thin and almost translucent, and you choose a slightly smaller hoop to match its size. A hoop you made especially for the smaller pelts that come in the late autumn before the ice locks the streams. You lace it with the same careful attention, using shorter lengths of sinew and making the loops closer together so that the tension will be evenly distributed across the delicate hide. And you pull the sinew with an even lighter hand, feeling the thin leather respond with a quick, sensitive springiness that tells you to stop before you pull too far. The small pelt stretches easily, and when you hang it from the rafters, it looks like a pale golden coin suspended among the larger discs, catching the light with a gentle, honeyed glow. The afternoon has now deepened into its later stages, though the light from the window still shows no dramatic change, only a slow, steady dimming that is more a thickening of the air than a loss of brightness. The shadows in the corners of the room have grown softer and wider, and the grease lamp which you lit hours ago has become more prominent, its small flame casting a warm yellow circle that pushes back the encroaching grey. You finish the last of the pelts, a large, dark hide that was the final one you scraped, and you stretch it onto the largest hoop you have, a sturdy circle of thick willow that you made last spring and that has been waiting all summer and all autumn for this winter's work. The pelt is heavy and the hoop bows slightly under the tension, but the willow is strong and the sinew is secure, and when you hang it from the rafter it settles into place with a low, soft creak that is the voice of the wood accepting its burden. With all the pelts now stretched and hung, you stand in the center of the cabin and look slowly around you, taking in the quiet circle of hoops that sway above your head, the dark shapes of the rafters half hidden behind their pale surfaces, the small bright flame of the grease lamp reflected in the polished leather, and the steady red glow of the stove that keeps the drawing room warm and dry. The work of the day is nearly complete, and what remains is only the tidying and the closing, the small, quiet rituals that will settle the cabin into the long, cold night. But for now you simply stand, letting the stillness of the moment hold you, feeling the deep, quiet satisfaction of tasks done with patience and care, while outside the endless cold presses its silent weight against the walls, and the short January day slides further into the blue, patient dusk. The afternoon light has been changing for some time now, though it has done so with such a slow, patient gradualness that you might not have noticed it if you had not paused in your work to look up at the hooped pelts hanging from the rafters. The grey-white glow that filled the window all morning has begun to shift, losing its flat, even quality and taking on a subtle undertone of blue, a coolness that seems to seep into the air even though the stove still hums with its steady warmth. It is the light of the deepening afternoon, the slow, gentle slide toward the early dusk that comes to this northern latitude in the middle of winter, a dusk that arrives not with drama, but with a quiet, almost imperceptible dimming, as if the day itself is growing tired and settling down to rest. You stand near the table with the last of the stretched pelts now hanging above you, and you let your eyes travel across the room, tracing the familiar shapes as they soften and blur in the changing light. The corners of the cabin, which were merely dim in the morning, have now filled with a deep, velvety shadow that seems to have its own texture, its own presence, and the objects that live in those corners, the buckets and the spare tools and the folded sacks, have become indistinct, their edges dissolving into the general darkness. Nearer to the stove, where the firelight reaches, the world is still warm and golden, the orange glow catching the surfaces of the table and the scraper and the clay pot of tallow with a gentle flickering brightness that makes the shadows dance slowly on the walls. The kettle sits on the cooler edge of the stove, the water inside still hot but no longer boiling, and a thin, wispy thread of steam rises from its spout, curling upward and then vanishing into the darker air near the ceiling. The steam catches the firelight as it rises, becoming briefly visible as a pale, twisting shape before it fades into nothing. A small, quiet ghost that appears and disappears without a sound. You watch it for a moment, the way you might watch the slow drift of snowflakes outside the window, not thinking about anything in particular, just resting your eyes on the gentle, repeating motion. The hooped pelts that hang from the rafters have been drying for several hours now, and they have begun to tighten on their frames, the leather pulling itself tauter as the moisture slowly leaves it and passes into the warm, dry air of the cabin. The pelts you hung first, the ones you stretched in the early afternoon, are now noticeably stiffer to the touch, their surfaces less pliable and more resistant when you reach up and press them with your knuckle, and they have taken on a pale, matte finish that reflects the light differently than the damp leather did. A softer, more even glow that speaks of the curing process moving toward its end. The ones you hung more recently are still damp and dark and slightly cool, but they too will dry in time, and by morning the entire circle of hoops will be stiff and flat and ready for the fur press. You lower your hand from the pout you were testing and turn back to the table, where the tools of the day's labor still lie in their working positions. The scraper with its blade angled up, the whetstone darkened with oil, the clay pot with its film of ice now melted into a shallow pool of cold water, the coil of leftover sinew, the small knife you used for cutting the lacing, and the wooden bowl of scrapings that is still heaped full and still waiting to be emptied. The work is not quite finished, because the tidying must be done before the cabin can settle fully into the night. But you do not hurry toward it. There is a particular stillness in this part of the day, a pause between the active labor of the scraping and stretching and the quiet closing rituals of the evening, and you let yourself rest in that pause for a while longer, standing by the table with your hands loosely clasped in front of you, and your shoulders relaxed under the wool shawl. The silence of the cabin has deepened along with the light, becoming thicker and more layered, as if each passing hour has added a new blanket of quiet to the ones that came before. The stove still murmurs, a low, steady sound that is almost below hearing, and the occasional soft tick of a cooling log or the settling of ash in the firebox punctuates the stillness without interrupting it. Outside, the world is as silent as it has been all day. But now the silence outside feels different, heavier, as if the cold itself has grown stronger with the approach of evening, pressing down on the snow and the spruce trees and the frozen bay with a weight that can be felt even through the thick log walls. No wind stirs the branches, the snow does not shift, and the only movement in the vast white wilderness beyond the oiled window is the slow, invisible arc of the sun as it sinks toward its brief disappearance below the horizon. You walk to the window and stand before it, close enough that the cold radiating from the hide-covered frame touches your cheeks with a faint, sharp coolness. The scene outside is now touched with that same blue-gray twilight that has crept into the cabin, the snow no longer white, but a pale, shadowed lavender, the spruce trees darkening from gray-green to near black, the sky a single, smooth expanse of deepening slate. It is a landscape without edges, a world in which the snow and the sky seem to blend together at some indefinite distance, erasing the line that separates earth from air, and the effect is one of floating, of being suspended in a soft grey-blue void that has no end and no beginning. You feel the vastness of it pressed gently against your mind, not as a threat, but as a kind of release, a reminder of how small the cabin is, and yet how safe, how warm, how held. You breathe out, and your breath fogs the hide for a moment, a small pale circle that appears and then fades, and you turn away from the window and return to the stove. The fire needs feeding, and you kneel before it with the same patient attention you have given it throughout the day, opening the heavy iron door and peering inside at the bed of coals that still glows beneath a thin coating of pale ash. You take the iron rod and stir the fire gently, bringing the brighter coals to the surface, and then you add 2 pieces of wood, placing them carefully in the space you have cleared, angling them for air, and closing the door with a soft, final clank that rings very quietly in the stillness. The flames find the new wood and rise with a quiet eagerness, and the warmth pushes outward against your face and hands, a familiar comfort that you accept without thought, the way you accept the beating of your own heart. The grease lamp on the ledge has become the brightest thing in the room now, its small, steady flame casting a warm yellow circle that pushes against the gathering shadows and holds them at bay. The lamp burns with a faint, savory smell, the rendered bare fat feeding the moss wick with a slow, even consumption. And you check the level of the fat in the stone dish and see that it is still sufficient for several more hours, enough to last until you are ready to sleep. The flame flickers once, twice, as a tiny draught moves through the room and then settles, and the shadows on the walls flicker with it and then are still again. You begin the slow work of tidying the table, not because there is any urgency to it, but because the day is moving toward its close and the tools need to be put right for the morning. You pick up the scraper first, wiping the blade clean with the wool rag, and then passing it lightly over the whetstone to ensure the edge is still sharp, the soft, metallic whisper of the sharpening filling the quiet for a brief moment before fading. Then you wipe the blade with a cloth dipped in tallow, a thin, oily film that will protect the iron from the moisture in the air and prevent the rust that would dull its edge, and you set the scraper in its place on the shelf above the table, where it will wait for the next morning. The whetstone you wipe clean of the grey, oily residue that has built up on its surface and set beside the scraper, and the clay pot of water you empty into the bucket near the door, the cold water splashing softly against the wooden sides. The coil of sinew you gather and hang from its hook on the wall, and the small knife you wipe and return to its sheath at your waist. The wooden bowl of scrapings is full, heaped slightly above the rim, with the pale waxy matter that you have removed from the day's pelts, and you carry it to the door that leads to the attached fur store, a small unheated room where the frozen pelts are kept and where the refuse bucket sits. The air in the store is colder, much colder, a sharp, dry chill that bites at your exposed skin, and you move quickly, emptying the bowl into the larger refuse bucket, and then returning to the warmth of the main room, closing the door firmly behind you to keep the cold out. The bowl you set back on the table, empty now and clean enough, and you brush your hands together to knock away any remaining particles of the scrapings. The cabin is now orderly, the table clear except for the bowl and the lamp, the tools all put away, the hooped pelts swaying gently above your head, the stove humming its low, steady hum, and the blue-grey light from the window fading so gradually that it is almost impossible to mark the moment when the day finally gives way to the night. You stand in the middle of the room, your hands resting on your hips, and you look slowly around at the quiet, familiar space, feeling the deep, soft tiredness that has settled into your muscles after the long hours of work. A tiredness that is not unpleasant, but instead feels earned, substantial, a record of the day written into your body. The afternoon has now almost entirely given way to the twilight, and the objects in the room have become shapes rather than things, their details erased by the darkness and replaced by the memory of themselves. The hanging pelts are pale, floating discs that catch the faintest glint of the firelight, and the tools on the shelf are hidden in shadow, and the window is now a dark, featureless square that reflects the lamp instead of showing the world outside. The cold has tightened its grip on the land, and the stillness is complete, and you find yourself moving slowly, your footsteps soft on the floorboards, your breath slow and even, as if you are already half asleep even while standing. The long, quiet evening lies ahead, and after it the long, quiet night, and the cabin will hold its warmth and its peace through all the frozen hours until the grey light returns and the work begins again. The tidying of the immediate workspace is done now, the scraper wiped and put away on its shelf, the whetstone cleaned and set beside it, the coil of sinew hung from its hook, and the bowl of scrapings emptied into the refuse bucket in the cold store. The table stands clear and bare except for the grease lamp, whose small, steady flame continues to push a warm yellow circle against the deepening shadows of the evening. You have been standing for a moment in the middle of the room, letting the quiet settle around you, feeling the slow, easy tiredness in your back and shoulders that comes from a full day of steady, patient work. Outside, the last of the blue-grey twilight has faded into a darkness so complete that the window now shows nothing but a faint, silvery reflection of the lamp and the fire, and the world beyond the log walls has vanished entirely into the grip of the January night. But the day is not quite finished, because the pelts that have been drying for the past several days, the ones you hooped and hung earlier in the week, are now ready to be taken down and pressed and bound into the fur pack. and this final task, quiet and unhurried, will carry you gently to the close of the evening. You turn first to the stove, because the fire needs to be settled for the long night ahead, and because the warmth it gives is what makes the final work possible. You open the heavy iron door, and the glow of the coals washes over your face with a soft orange light, revealing the bed of embers that still burns steadily beneath a thin coat of pale ash. You take the iron rod and stir the fire carefully, breaking apart the larger coals and bringing the bright ones to the top. And then you select a thick solid log from the wood pile, a piece of black spruce that is heavy with resin, and that will burn slow and hot for many hours. You place it across the center of the firebox, settling it into the nest of coals with a gentle pressure, and you watch as the flames begin to lick around its edges, finding the cracks in the bark and the exposed grain of the split face, and then you close the door, leaving the vent open just enough to let the fire breathe through the long, cold darkness. The stove gives a low, satisfied hum, and the warmth begins to radiate outward with renewed strength. A steady, comforting presence that will hold the cabin through all the frozen hours until dawn. The kettle still sits on the cooler edge of the stove, the water inside no longer boiling but still very hot, and you lift it by its handle, using the folded cloth to protect your palm, and you set it directly over the center of the stove where the heat is strongest, so that it will simmer gently through the evening and keep a supply of warm water ready for tea or for washing. The kettle settles onto the iron with a soft metallic sound, and a fresh wisp of steam begins to curl from its spout, rising in a thin, pale ribbon that twists and then disappears into the dim air near the ceiling. You leave it there, and then you cross to the corner of the cabin where the oldest of the hooped pelts have been hanging for several days, their leather now dried to a stiff, even flatness that makes them look like large, pale coins suspended in the flickering light. The hoops are cool to the touch, and you reach up and take hold of the first one, a medium-sized circle of willow that holds a dark brown beaver pelt you scraped and stretched 3 days ago. You lift the hoop carefully off its hemp cord, and the pelt swings gently in your hands, its surface smooth and taut and its fur facing inward toward you, a dense, glossy mat of deep chestnut that seems to absorb the firelight rather than reflect it. You carry the hoop to the table and set it down flat, the leather side facing up, and you press the center of the pelt with the pad of your thumb, testing its stiffness with a slow, firm pressure. The leather is dry, completely dry, and it resists your thumb with a crisp, rigid springiness that tells you it is ready to be taken off the frame. It has no soft spots, no lingering dampness that would cause it to rot or mildew in the press, and so you reach for the small knife at your waist and begin the careful work of cutting the sinew lacing that holds the pelt to the hoop. You work slowly, because the sinew is tight and the willow is springy, and a sudden slip of the knife could cut the leather or your own hand. You slide the tip of the blade under the first loop, the one at the top of the hoop, and you slice upward with a gentle, controlled motion, severing the sinew with a soft, dry snap. The tension releases and the edge of the pelt curls slightly inward, freed from the pull of the frame. You move to the next loop, and then the next, working your way around the circle with the same steady, clockwise progression you used when you laced the pelt onto the hoop hours or days ago. And with each cut the hide loosens a little more, until finally the last strand of sin parts and the pelt lies free on the table, a perfect flat disc of dried leather and dense fur. You lift the pelt from the table and hold it in both hands, feeling its lightness now that the moisture has all departed, feeling the smooth, even surface of the leather and the soft, deep pile of the fur. You run your palm across the flesh side, checking for any remaining imperfections, any small patches of membrane that might have been missed during the scraping, but there are none, only the fine, velvety grain of properly cured hide. Then you fold the pelt carefully, fur side inward, bringing the edges together with a slow, even pressure that creates a soft, neat package about the size of a large book, the leather side facing out and the valuable fur protected on the inside. You press the fold with your palm, smoothing it flat, and then you set the folded pelt aside and turn to the next hoop. The second pelt you take down is a silvery chestnut, a little larger than the first, and it has been hanging for 4 days, so that its leather is even drier and more rigid, the surface feeling almost like thin, flexible wood under your fingers. You test it with your thumb and find it ready, and you cut the sinew lacing with the same careful, methodical movements, freeing the pelt from the willow frame and laying it flat on the table. The fur side of this one is soft and shimmering, the silver tips of the guard hairs catching the lamplight and glowing with a faint pearly sheen, and you fold it as you folded the first, fur side inward, bringing the edges together and pressing the package flat with a slow, smoothing motion of your palm. You work your way through all the pelts that are dry enough to be packed, checking each one with a firm press of the thumb to the center, lifting it from its hoop and cutting the sinew with the small knife, folding it precisely and adding it to the growing stack on the table. Some of the pelts have been hanging for a week or more, and their leather is so stiff and dry that it crackles slightly when you fold it, a quiet, papery sound that is the voice of the completed curing. Others are only recently dried, and their leather still has a faint, cool pliancy that resists the fold just a little before settling into place. You treat each one with the same calm, even attention, the same gentle pat of the hand that smooths the folded surface and checks the alignment of the edges, and as the stack grows taller, the quiet satisfaction of the work settles over you like the warmth from the stove. When all the dry pelts have been removed and folded, you gather up the empty hoops and lean them in their corner near the door, where they will wait to be used again tomorrow or the next day, their willow frames now bare and pale and slightly curved from the tension they have held. The hoops make a soft wooden clatter as you stack them, a sound that is brief and quiet and that fades quickly into the stillness. Then you turn your attention to the fur press, which stands against the wall near the door, a simple device made of two smooth, heavy planks of spruce that are held together by 4 wooden pegs, each one as thick as your wrist and polished by years of use. The press is currently empty, its top plank resting on the bottom one, with a small gap between them, and you lift the top plank and set it aside, leaning it carefully against the wall. The bottom plank is smooth and flat, its surface darkened with the oils and residues of countless pelts that have been pressed between these boards over the winters, and you take a moment to brush it clean with your hand, sweeping away a few stray bits of dried membrane and the fine, powdery dust that always settles on still surfaces in the cabin. Then you begin to load the folded pelts into the press, laying them one by one in a neat, even pile, fur side inward and leather side out, aligning the edges so that the pack will be square and compact and easy to tie. You place the pelts with a slow, deliberate care, because the way they are packed will determine how well they travel when the spring brigades come to carry them to York Factory. A poorly packed bale can shift and loosen on the long journey over the frozen rivers and the rough portages, and a pelt that is creased or crushed will fetch a lower price when the London fur graders inspect it, so you take your time, smoothing each folded hide as you lay it down, pressing out any small wrinkles or air pockets, building the pack layer by patient layer. The pile grows steadily, the dark and pale leathers alternating in a quiet geometric pattern, and when all the dry pelts have been loaded, the stack is nearly a foot high, a dense, heavy block of compressed fur and hide that represents many days of quiet, solitary labor. You lift the top plank of the press and settle it onto the pile, fitting the holes in the corners over the upright pegs that rise from the bottom plank, and then you push down with a steady, even pressure, compressing the pelts further and bringing the 2 planks closer together. The wood creaks softly as it takes the load, and the pelts settle into themselves with a faint rustling sigh, and you hold the pressure while you reach for the 4 wooden pegs that will lock the press closed. These pegs are tapered at one end, and you drive them through the holes in the top plank, one by one, tapping them gently with the heel of your hand until they are snug and secure, holding the press tightly shut with the pelts firmly compressed inside. The sound of the peg seating into place is a soft wooden thump repeated 4 times, a quiet, final punctuation to the work of packing. Now the fur pack must be tied, so that it can be handled and stacked and loaded onto a sled without coming apart. You go to the shelf where the leather straps are kept, long, narrow strips of moose hide that have been cut and cured and oiled until they are supple and strong, and you take 2 of them and return to the press. You loop the first strap around the short side of the pack, pulling it tight and knotting it with a simple secure hitch that you learned long ago and that your hands tie without any need for thought. And then you wrap the second strap around the long side, cinching it down so that the planks are held even more firmly together. You check the tension of both straps, tugging on them with your fingers to make sure they will not slip, and then you trim the excess ends with your knife and tuck them under the bindings so they will not catch on anything. The pack is now complete, a solid, compact bale of beaver pelts, tied and pressed and ready for the spring, and you lift it by one of the straps and carry it to the space near the door where it will sit with the other packs that have been made in the weeks before, waiting for the ice to break and the brigades to arrive. You set the pack down with a soft, solid thump, and you straighten up and press your hands against the small of your back, stretching the muscles that have tightened during the bending and lifting. The firelight flickers across the dark shape of the pack, touching the pale leather of the straps and the smooth, oiled surface of the planks, and you stand for a moment looking at it, not with any particular pride, but with the quiet, calm awareness that the day's work has been finished well and finished fully, that the pelts you scraped and stretched and dried and folded are now secure, ready for the long journey that will take them, eventually, to a place you shaped and stretched and dried and folded cabin in the frozen bay, in stretched the ferrets of the snail jigjemi already chachinil. You turn away from the door and move back toward the stove, where the kettle is now sending a steady plume of steam into the dim air, and you pour yourself a last cup of spruce tea for the evening, the liquid dark and fragrant and warming your hands through the tin cup. You stand by the stove, sipping the tea slowly, feeling the heat of the fire on your face and the solid, grounded tiredness in your legs and arms, and you look around the cabin one final time, taking in the cleared table, the empty hoops leaning in their corner, the shadowed shelves where the tools are all in their proper places, the hanging pelts that still remain above your head, drying slowly for tomorrow's packing, and the heavy, solid shape of the fur press standing against the wall, empty again, and waiting. There is no sense of an ending, because there is no ending to this work, only a calm continuity of routine. The same tasks that will be taken up again at first light, the same quiet rhythm that will carry you through another day and another, while the deep freeze holds its silent, patient grip on the land and the long dark hours of the winter night stretch out before you, calm and complete and utterly at peace. The grease lamp on the ledge has been burning for many hours now, its small flame steady and golden and no larger than the tip of your thumb, and it is the last light in the cabin, besides the soft orange eye of the stove's air vent that glows through the iron grate like a single ember suspended in the darkness. You have finished every task the day held for you, every small, patient motion of scraping and stretching and pressing and binding, and now there is nothing left to do, except to let the night settle over the post with its deep, silent cold, and to let your own body rest after the long, quiet labor of the hours since dawn. You stand near the table, your hands loose at your sides, and you look at the small flame of the lamp for what feels like a long time, watching the way it flickers almost imperceptibly in the still air, the way it casts a warm, trembling circle on the dark wood of the table and leaves everything beyond that circle in a soft, velvety shadow. You reach for the lamp, wrapping your fingers carefully around the cool stone base, and you lift it from the ledge and carry it slowly across the room toward the hearth. The flame wavers slightly with your movement but holds steady, and the shadows on the walls sway gently, the dark shapes of the hanging pelts and the fur press, and the empty willow hoops all seeming to shift and then settle as you pass. You set the lamp down on the hearthstone, a flat, smooth rock that has been placed in front of the stove to catch any stray sparks, and you kneel beside it. The heat from the stove presses against your face and your hands and the front of your wool dress, a dry, enveloping warmth that feels like the closest thing to a living presence in the room. You lean forward and cup your hand behind the flame, and then you blow across it with a single soft breath, and the flame goes out, the yellow light vanishing and leaving only a thin, curling wisp of smoke that rises for a moment and then disappears into the darkness. The smell of the extinguished wick, a faint, waxy scent tinged with the savory richness of the bear fat, drifts past you and then fades, and the cabin is now lit only by the soft, reddish glow that escapes from the vent and the seams of the stove door. In the new darkness, the room transforms. The shapes you know so well become indistinct, their edges blurring into the general blackness until they are more memories than objects, more presences than things. The hanging pelts above your head are pale, floating discs that catch the faintest glimmer from the stove, and they seem to hang in the air without support, as if they have forgotten the strings that hold them. The table is a dark, solid form in the center of the room, and the shelves on the wall are invisible, their tools hidden away until the morning. The window is now utterly black, a square of deeper darkness set into the log wall, and even if you were to press your face close to the oiled hide, you would see nothing but the faint, silvery reflection of the stove's glow, and perhaps, if the clouds have thinned, the distant, cold glint of a single star. You rise from the hearthstone, your knees pressing into the floor with a soft sound that is swallowed immediately by the quiet, and you walk to the low stool that sits near the stove. A simple seat made of 3 split logs with a curved seat worn smooth by years of use. You settle onto it, feeling the warmth of the fire through the wood, and you reach for the wool blanket that hangs over the back of the stool, a heavy, dark blue blanket woven at the company's own mill and traded to your husband for pelts in a year that now seems very distant. You wrap the blanket around your shoulders and draw it close across your chest, and the wool traps the warmth of your body and the warmth of the stove and holds it against you in a soft, steady embrace. The tin cup of spruce tea is still warm, though no longer hot, and you lift it from the hearthstone where you set it earlier and cradle it in both hands. The tea is dark and slightly bitter, the taste of the spruce tips lingering on your tongue with a clean, resinous sharpness that reminds you of the forest in summer, though summer is so far away now that the memory feels like something you read about in a book rather than something you have lived. You take a sip, and then another, and the warmth of the tea travels down your throat and spreads outward into your chest, a small internal fire that works alongside the larger fire in the stove to hold the deep, penetrating cold at bay. Outside, that cold is absolute, a physical weight that presses down on the roof and the walls and the frozen ground with a pressure that has no release. A cold so deep that if you were to step outside without your furs, the moisture in your breath would freeze in the air before it could form a cloud, falling to the snow as a fine, crystalline dust. You think of the cold without fear, as you think of the darkness without fear, because the cabin has stood through many January nights before this one, and will stand through many more. Its thick spruce logs holding the warmth around you like a cupped hand holds a small flame. The stove clicks and murmurs beside you, its voice so familiar that you no longer hear it as a separate thing, but only as part of the larger quiet, a quiet that extends outward from the cabin in all directions, across the frozen clearing and into the black spruce forest and over the ice-locked bay and northward into the endless empty barrens where the caribou have long since migrated south, and the only things that move are the stars in their slow cold arcs and the pale shimmering curtains of the northern. Your mind does not wander to any particular destination, and it does not linger on any particular thought. It rests, as your body rests, in the calm, suspended stillness of the winter night. You are aware of your own breathing, slow and even and quiet, the air moving in and out of your lungs with a rhythm that is as steady as the rhythm of the scraper was this morning, as steady as the rhythm of the sinew passing through the holes in the pelt, as steady as the rhythm of the folded hides being laid into the press. The day's work is folded into your body now, a satisfied physical memory that hums softly in your muscles and your joints, and you let it be there without examining it, the way you let the fire be there, the way you let the darkness be there, the way you let the cold be there beyond the walls. The stove settles with a soft, internal sigh, a piece of the heavy spruce log collapsing into the bed of coals and sending a brief, brighter glow through the vent before it fades. The warmth in the room is steady now, and it will hold for several hours before the fire needs to be fed again, and you know without thinking about it that you will wake in the deep of the night, as you always do, and cross the cold floor in the darkness to add a new log and stir the embers, and then return to your blanket and your stool and the slow, patient waiting for the dawn. This is the rhythm of the winter night, a rhythm as old as the cabin and as old as the trade itself, a rhythm of waking and sleeping and waking again, of tending the fire and listening to the silence and knowing that the world outside is frozen to its core and that you are held, for these few dark hours, in a pocket of warmth and stillness that is all the more precious for the vast, indifferent cold that surrounds it. You finish the tea, the last sip cool and slightly gritty, with the fine sediment of the spruce needles, and you set the tin cup down on the hearthstone beside the extinguished lamp. The cup makes a soft, metallic sound, a small, clear note that rings for a moment and then is gone, absorbed by the logs and the pelts and the heavy, patient air. You pull the blanket more tightly around your shoulders, and let your head rest back against the rough log wall behind the stool, feeling the texture of the wood through the wool of your linen cap, the small knots and ridges, and the smooth, worn patches where your back has rested 1,000 times before. Your eyes close, not because you are falling asleep, though sleep is near, but because in the darkness there is no difference between having your eyes open and having them closed, and it is easier somehow to let them rest. In the vast, silent wilderness of Rupert's Land, the night stretches on without interruption. A single, unbroken expanse of cold and darkness and stillness that covers the land like a second, deeper ocean. The stars that you cannot see from inside the cabin are sharp and clear and impossibly bright. The constellation of the Great Bear wheeling slowly around the pole star and the frozen surface of the bay, just a short walk through the snow, gleams with a faint, bluish light that seems to come from within the ice itself. The spruce trees stand in their silent rows, their branches heavy with the accumulated snow of a month of storms, and no wind stirs them, and no creature moves among them, and the only sound in all the world is the sound of the cold itself. A sound that is not a sound at all, but a vast, immeasurable silence that presses down on everything, holding the land in a grip that will not loosen for months yet, not until the sun climbs higher in the sky, begins its slow groaning retreat. Inside the cabin you breathe slowly, deeply, your chest rising and falling under the heavy wool blanket, your hands resting loose and still in your lap. The fur press stands near the door, its dark shape solid and square, the beaver pelts inside it bound tight and ready for the spring, and the hanging pelts above your head continue their slow, almost imperceptible drying, turning gently on their strings in the warm air rising from the stove. The tools on their shelves are invisible in the darkness, but they are there, waiting, and the empty willow hoops lean in their corner, ready to be used again when the next day's scraping is done and the next set of pelts needs to be stretched. The cabin and all its contents, the tools and the pelts and the press and the woman wrapped in the blue wool blanket, exist in a state of quiet, suspended patience, waiting for the distant, unimagined spring that will arrive eventually, as it always does, but that has no urgency and no claim on this frozen, silent hour. The January night crawls forward 1 minute at a time, each minute exactly the same as the one before it, and the deep freeze holds the world in a stillness so complete that it seems as if time itself has slowed to a stop, arrested by the endless cold. You drift, not into sleep, but into a state that is like a calm, wide-awake dream, a place where the boundary between yourself and the cabin and the darkness and the warmth becomes thin and permeable, where the soft murmur of the stove is your own heartbeat, and your own heartbeat is the pulse of the small, bright point of life at the edge of the frozen bay. The fur pack stands ready, a quiet monument to the day's work and the week's work and the winter's work, and you rest beside it, motionless and at peace, while the long dark hours of the night stretch on and on around you, silent and deep and utterly, perfectly calm.